Hi, my name is Daniel. I really love movies, and today I'm going to be ranking the Predator franchise. Compared to Alien, my last ranking, these were a lot quicker to get through. It probably doesn't sound fair to compare the two, but they bounce off each other in so many ways. If I'm pulling out the Alien movies, I'm pulling out the Predator movies. That's probably because, just to recap, these were the first, not one of the first, of the major horror franchises I was ever exposed to. Obviously, though, I grew up to be a lot more of a Predator stan. Again, not to compare it too much to Alien, but it's kind of ironic. Like I mentioned in that video, I'm not the biggest fan of science fiction. While these are still sci-fi horror, most of these lean heavily into action, which is my least favorite genre. But I think they strike a much better balance with all the genres they go for. All being said, this list is going to be very interesting. And by that, I mean the gripes I have are going to be very few. This might be one of those horror franchises where each movie does the same, but always seems to add something new or fresh to the table. For a horror icon, the Predator lore is very interesting. With each movie, they always expand the lore in some way. On that same note, however, this list might be more unconventional than my Alien list. Depending on the mood I'm in, this list might fluctuate around a lot. That's kinda how hard it was to decide with some of these. You'll see what I mean when I finally get to it, so this is just my ranking and I'd love to hear yours. But without further ado, here's mine. In last place is gonna be Prey. Not to already contradict myself, but if there's any I'd have a few more gripes with, it's this one. Notice I just said a few more, meaning they are still far, but mostly few. I'm in that small percentage of people who thought this movie got way too much credit. To me, it is not the best since the original, and is very much a streaming film. However, I wasn't necessarily disappointed or even all that underwhelmed. It just wasn't all that. So what are these flaws I have? First and foremost, the idea was actually very bold, where you have the Predator up against the Native American culture. The execution, while not terrible, wasn't exactly the best either. It was just mid. Most of that has to do with the fact that this movie feels largely underwritten. The characters, especially the main character, feel very underdeveloped, which doesn't give this story that many stakes. All in all though, I still get that right amount of what I always come to these movies for, which is some pretty decent Predator action. I might not be the biggest fan of this particular Predator design, or even the almost random CGI, which gives this movie that made-to-streaming feel, but I just can't bring myself to hate or even strongly dislike this one, to be honest. It's not what I would consider my least favorite, but my least best. In sixth place is going to be the original Predator. I told y'all this list was going to be very unconventional, but I hope I've convinced you that I'm going to have nothing but kind words for all of these. And of course, the iconic original is going to be no exception. As far as why it's this low, first of all, objectively speaking, I'd absolutely consider Predator to be one of the best action movies of all time. Looking at it as a franchise though, I consider this movie to be merely a foundation or proof of concept of a much broader world we get to explore. Other than that, I don't really have that many notes. This movie is actually quite simple and straightforward. A sci-fi action movie that, above all, is an 80s creature feature. If there is one minute gripe I have with this movie, and I mean very minute, is that the lead is a bit overpowered compared to the rest of the cast. A lead, however, that you can't get me wrong with, especially when we get a few iconic memes from him.
Get to the chopper!
Maybe I should have just been there for this movie, but yes, a solid introduction to both the world and character of Predator. In fifth place is gonna be Predator 2, a movie that's not quite the black sheep and one people have come around to, but still brushed under the rug. A fact that actually makes me appreciate this movie, despite it being one of my quote-unquote lowest. I remember a time before the most recent Predator sequels when this movie was considered to be widely low tier, but even then, I can't say I ever felt that way. Again, getting right to it, it's a sequel that doesn't quite blow the first movie out of the water, but still has a lot more going for it than most people let on. First off, like I said in my intro, it doesn't just repeat the first movie, and even expands the lore a little bit. To be honest, in my opinion, it might do a few or even many things better than the first movie. There's a lot more I vibe with at least. Like, for example, the city setting. The jungle might be more isolated, sure, but the human drama going on throughout the city is a much more compelling backdrop. You have all involve these gang wars, police drama, and of course, the Predator just sneaking around in the middle. Which brings me to another point. Danny Glover might not be the better lead, but the better leading character, and the fact that he's a lot more relatable. Because yes, he is no Dutch, which is what arguably makes his final confrontation with the Predator a lot more interesting than Dutch's. Other than that, I'm telling you guys, it was really hard to find anything to pick apart with these movies. This one might lean more heavily into action than some of the others, which is my least favorite genre, but it never feels excessive. This movie has a good amount of energy, and even some of that early 90s charm and or camp. I'd say things move at just the right pace, which can still be slow at times, sure, but what makes what I think is a pretty bonkers finale all the more exciting. All that being said, I think this movie deserves some kudos, especially for being this unrealized hidden gem of sorts. This came out at a time when horror, especially franchises, were at a little bit of a low point. So I have this weird thought that people maybe were just over it and couldn't quite give it its all. Those same people, I imagine, are the ones who came around to what I think is an absolutely worthy sequel. But in third place is gonna be Alien vs Predator Requiem. If you watched my Alien ranking, then you would know that I have a deep love or appreciation for what I think is a very misunderstood movie. Not trying to get ranty again, but while it was easier to place on my Alien list, it was a lot trickier to place here. Just to do a little recap, it's the second ever Predator movie I watched, immediately back to back with the first one I ever watched, which of course was the original Alien vs Predator. And that's one of the many but the strongest reasons I have such a deep love for this movie and why it's this high. You can get more of my thoughts on this in my Alien video, but I think this movie is that dark, also quite literally as in relentless, small town slasher style B movie of both franchises. One that I think that people are just too hard on and should start coming more around to. As far as why it's what I'd say a tad lower on my Predator list, I feel like this movie serves the Alien side of things more, in the sense that it advances or covers new ground in that franchise than this one. Predator just does his thing here, and like I'll keep saying, no complaining from me. If anything, it's both the highlight reel and the middle of the road entry of the series. A good example of nothing more and nothing less. And third place is going to be The Predator. If this franchise is that rare example of you truly never know what you're gonna get, this has to be a pretty bold testament to that, to say the very least. Yes, this movie is absolutely ridiculous. The story here is very convoluted, and it feels a lot like a fanfiction. Most of all, it has this bonkers, nearly MCU level of humor, and feels like a parody of itself and the franchise. But alas, that's exactly why it works for me as, again, with everything I said about this franchise, a rather welcome installment. I mean, with the serious tone of all the others, this one feels like a nice breather, or one I feel like we needed in a way. It did have these bonkers ideas that felt random and out of place, which is what made it feel like this cringy fanfiction. They might not all have worked, but considering the time this came out, and this might sound very specific, at least this wasn't a nostalgia-reliant legacy sequel. There were still some fun callbacks, of course, but for the most part, it did try to do some things new. As far as the comedy, not only does it work for me, but they couldn't have picked a better cast to sell it. They all bounce off each other so well, and you can tell they just had a lot of fun, just as I can have a lot of fun with this movie. What really brings it this high though, plain and simple, it just has this certain generational pull for me. There's just a whole lot more I'm drawn to and find entertaining. Or that's just my taste. Sort of like how I felt about Alien Resurrection, which I clearly find this movie to be similar in tone to. Speaking of Alien, one of the things I love the most about this movie is how it's pretty much a lighter version of Alien vs Predator Requiem, which again, I'm very fond of. And not just literally, where you can actually see things, but where you got those nice suburban vibes, and yes, that Disney Channel energy.
Here's a treat, you little shit.
Here, boy.
It might not have those slasher vibes or be as relentless, but at least it has, I'll admit, stronger characters. Particularly the lead, who's not only a new, younger perspective for the series, but one that I could also relate to growing up as the loser kid. On a random but related note, when I was also younger, I would literally make Predator mask and equipment out of tape and paper. So, in a way, this movie felt like a manifestation of that or something. I know that sounds completely random, but anyway, and moving on to some final points, I'm aware there were all these behind the scenes issues where there were these reshoots and edits, but it didn't quite ruin it for me. One of this movie's only faults is that I feel like it loses steam here and there, and by the end, I felt not completely, but a tad underwhelmed. It might have been because of what happened behind the scenes, but I still enjoy what I think is a fairly decent modern and or popcorn Predator movie. An absolute fun time that I'm glad exists. In second place is going to be Predators. This has to be the most mixed bag Predator movie. People either love it or hate it. There doesn't seem to be that much of an in-between. Not only do I love it, but I think it's the true best Predator sequel since the original. One that wasn't a crossover at least. I think this one was in some ways ahead of its time. Maybe I'm the only one, but this feels like a very early example of a solid legacy sequel. Something we have way too much of now. For better, but mostly worse. While it does rely a whole lot on nostalgia, and basically is a repeat of the original, like most legacy sequels, it has some particular elevations here that would only work for this franchise. It doesn't just take place in any jungle, but an alien jungle, the Predator planet, which of course makes it feel a lot more isolated. There's not just one Predator, but several, as the title suggests, but in more than one way. You have these 3 super Predators, which might be not the best set, but one of the most intimidating. But most of all, a group of people who are all essentially predators. Not that type, of course, but one of the best aspects of this movie. And not just because it makes them all these formidable foes against these particular predators. Like I've mentioned before, I'm a real sucker for stories where a group of unlikely people are forced to work together. For the type of people they are, and the particular world they're in, this is like a chef's kiss example of that type of story. All of which, of course, is brought to life by a solid direction by Robert Rodriguez. Though, I must say, there's an aspect of his style that I like that's kind of missing here. Yes, this is the same guy who gave us this, but also this. And I don't get any of that from here. Anyways, and to start bringing things full circle, I do have a deep nostalgia for this one. Not just one that brings it this high on the list, but one that complements another nostalgia of mine. After I had first discovered the AVP movies, I developed a certain fascination for both franchises, mostly Predator, and fortunately for me, this movie came out at around that same time, as if it were strangely complementing it. My uncle got me the DVD for Christmas that year, and let's just say my newfound interest in the franchise was more than satisfied. But in first place is Alien vs. Predator. Lo and behold, the first of either franchise I ever watched. One that I just happened to walk in on while it was playing in the living room, in a night I'll never forget. An overall entry-level horror movie that was not just my entry, but a massive level up of what would become my eventual love for horror movies. Where I said that AVP Requiem, which I watched on the same night immediately afterwards, served the alien side of things, I'd say that this served the Predator side of things in some pretty big ways. I absolutely love what they did with their mythology, especially if this was the first one I ever watched, where they tap into those ancient alien theories. If there was any more formidable foe to put against the Predator, it was in fact the Xenomorph. Most of all, and my favorite aspect of this movie, it's the first time we ever get a human and Predator team up. Not only does the, what I think, bold reason they hunt Xenomorphs complement the Predator culture, but the human and Predator team up was leaning the most into the Predator's always apparent anti-hero qualities. If I'm to make a jab at Prey, this was the first, and stronger, female-led Predator film. The character of Lex Woods has to be one of my favorite final girls in general. I love the very nuanced way she's written, and how she not only teams up with a Predator, but also, essentially, becomes and is respected by them. Anyways, besides nostalgia, there's another special reason I have a deep fondness for this movie that, because of my deeper fondness for Predator, I wanted to save for this video. video? Well, I'd say it's one of those movies that really piqued my interest and led me into pursuing screenwriting. In fact, one of the first scripts I ever wrote was a crossover between Alien, Predator, and Friday the 13th. A script that I wrote when I was just a naive 12-year-old that would eventually evolve into the first original movie I ever wrote. If that doesn't scream full circle, I don't know what does. But that was my ranking of the Predator franchise. Up next, I'll be looking at both the Resident Evil and the Underworld franchises. Just a reminder that you can now follow along as I go through movies before I rank them on my free Patreon. But as always, I hope you enjoyed this video. Like, comment, subscribe, and most importantly, keep loving movies.